Have you ever had a seemingly simple task completely derailed by someone who thinks they own the world? I was knee-deep in grease, elbows buried in a busted fishing boat, when I heard her. "That man is stealing a vessel." I glanced up, and there she was, Rhonda Mazize, our HOA president. She marched toward me with the force of someone who had just caught a pirate red-handed. Except this wasn't the high seas, it was my driveway. My boat, my property, and my time were now under scrutiny by her, as if this was some grand crime scene. With her stern look and a voice that could rival a drill sergeant's, she called the cops, demanded that I be arrested, and started spouting off about HOA codes, treating the rules like some sacred scripture. Little did she know, she'd picked the wrong boat on the wrong day, and karma doesn't need a permit. I was just tightening bolts under the morning sun, preparing the boat for a much-needed engine rebuild. The repair was crucial. It was the money I needed to pay my mortgage this month, which, to be honest, was already 2 weeks overdue thanks to a slow spring fishing season. The boat belonged to an old friend who needed the engine ready before the summer rush. I had promised him I'd have it running perfectly in 7 days. Pine Valley was meant to be my sanctuary, a place to work on marine engines without the distractions of city life. When I first bought the cabin 8 months ago, the HOA rules seemed reasonable enough. Little did I know, I was stepping into a place where reasonable rules and reasonable people didn't always exist side by side. The moment I cracked open the engine cover, preparing to get to work on the carburetor, I heard it. The unmistakable click-clack of high heels on concrete. I turned to see her approaching, clipboard in hand, as though she were on a mission from bureaucratic heaven. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying the kind of commanding tone that probably worked wonders at PDA meetings. "Do you have permission to dock a watercraft on HOA property?" I straightened up, trying to stay polite despite my growing confusion. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Logan Blake, and I own this cabin. This is my buddy's boat. Just helping him stay afloat, just like I'm trying to keep my own head above water this month." She didn't flinch, not even a little. Instead, she stopped about 10 feet away from me and made a show of flipping through her clipboard, scanning multiple pages like she was reviewing case law instead of neighborhood complaints. "I'm Rhonda Mazize, president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association," she announced, clearly expecting that her title would make me snap to attention. "Under Article 4, subsection C of our HOA covenant, any watercraft stored on association property must be properly registered with the HOA office, and all commercial activities require special permits and board approval." I looked around at my own property, genuinely baffled. The boat was clearly sitting in my driveway, not on association land. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this boat's on my property, not association land, and I'm not running a business here. I'm just helping a friend who needs his engine rebuilt." She narrowed her eyes, and I could almost hear her mental gears grinding into overdrive. She immediately pulled out her phone and began snapping pictures of both me and the boat from every angle, like she was preparing for a courtroom presentation. "That may be your interpretation of property boundaries, Mr. Blake," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "but the HOA board will need to review this situation thoroughly. Unauthorized vessels can pose serious safety and environmental hazards to our lakeside community." Then, as if trying to make the moment more official, she produced what looked like the most ridiculous measuring device I'd ever seen. It was some contraption I could only describe as an overzealous measure of everything. She began documenting the boat's length like she was outlining a crime scene for CSI, HOA edition. I stood there holding my wrench, trying to figure out whether I was dealing with someone truly concerned about the community or just a bored individual looking to make something out of nothing. The way she moved around the boat, taking measurements and photos, suggested this was the most excitement she had had in months. "Look, Mrs. Mazize, I completely understand that you have rules to follow and a community to protect. But this is just a temporary job. I'll have the boat finished and out of here within a week tops," I said, trying to de-escalate the situation. She finished her absurd routine, scribbling more notes on her clipboard, occasionally glancing up at me like she was waiting for me to confess to some heinous crime against neighborhood property values. The length appears to exceed our guidelines for temporary storage of recreational vehicles, she declared, tapping her pen against the clipboard with exaggerated satisfaction. I'll need to research the exact regulations and precedents, but you should definitely expect to hear from the HOA board within 48 hours. As she spoke, I noticed something deeper in her eyes, a kind of desperate intensity. She wasn't just enforcing rules. There was a fear, a need to control something far beyond boat storage regulations. In that moment, I realized I had made an enemy. I stood there, wrench in hand, trying to make sense of the bizarre situation that had just unfolded. I moved to Pine Valley for peace and quiet, but now, it seemed that simply repairing a friend's boat had turned into a crime scene under her watch. The next morning, I stepped outside to find that the peace I'd come to Pine Valley for was nothing but a distant memory. As I walked out of my cabin with my first cup of coffee in hand, I immediately noticed that Rhonda's presence had escalated overnight. Bright orange warning signs had sprouted like an invasive plant along my property line, each one screaming for attention. HA investigation in progress, the largest banner read, positioned right where anyone driving past would see it. Smaller signs followed, warning about unregistered watercraft and potential code violations, each one bearing Rhonda's bold signature as though she were claiming territory in a way that could only be rivaled by territorial animals marking their domain. She had even mounted a blinking fake camera on a pine tree like a child's science fair project gone horribly wrong. It looked like she was preparing for some sort of neighborhood lockdown, except the crime was a simple boat repair. The whole display was a bizarre and humiliating spectacle. My property had become a quarantine zone, as if it were harboring a dangerous criminal enterprise. I stood there, staring at the signs, trying to process what I had just walked into. This wasn't just about a boat. This was about something far deeper. This was about control. And Rhonda had declared war. As I stood there contemplating this new layer of absurdity, a soft voice from behind me broke the silence. "She's been out here working since 6 o'clock this morning," said an elderly woman, who had approached from the cabin across the lake. "I'm Edna Thompson. Been watching this neighborhood for 23 years now, and I can honestly say I've never seen anything quite like this." Edna gestured to the signs with a mix of disapproval and grudging admiration. "That woman moved here about 18 months ago, right after her divorce. She treats the HOA like it's Homeland Security, with a nicer clipboard. The poor thing lives all alone at the end of Lakeshore Drive, and I think being HOA president gives her the sense of purpose she's been missing since her marriage fell apart. But she's been getting more intense about enforcement lately." Edna continued, shaking her head. "Last month, she tried to fine the Miller family for having their garbage cans visible from the street, exactly 17 minutes after the official pickup time. It's like she's transformed from a simple neighborhood manager to a full-time enforcer. It's her mission now. Every minor infraction is treated like a personal attack on her carefully constructed vision of community order." I could feel a weight lift off my chest as Edna shared her perspective. It wasn't just me. Rhonda had turned the HOA into something far more sinister than it was meant to be. What had started as a small inconvenience had morphed into an obsession, a desperate need to control the neighborhood with no regard for reason or fairness. We stood there, watching the signs, the absurdity of the situation sinking in. "You know," Edna said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "about half the stuff she's doing probably violates HOA rules more than anything you're doing with that boat. Those signs? They're definitely against the covenant. We're not supposed to post anything without board approval." The day stretched on, and as I continued to work on the boat engine, the circus Rhonda had created around my property became more and more impossible to ignore. Every few minutes, my eyes would drift to the orange signs. Every time I looked, it felt like I was trapped in some kind of bizarre performance, where I was the villain and Rhonda was the star of her own theatrical production. By noon, Rhonda herself made an appearance at the edge of my property, lurking like a hawk on a perch, watching every movement I made. I couldn't help but notice her binoculars. She was conducting surveillance. On me. Over a boat. It wasn't just enforcement anymore. It was obsession. Rhonda was going through the motions of some community-wide investigation, documenting every little thing I did, as if my actions could spark some neighborhood-wide disaster. She was following me like I was a criminal mastermind, when in reality, I was just a guy helping a friend. As she stalked my every move with her binoculars, she called out to me, her voice full of self-satisfaction. "I've documented everything, Mr. Blake. Every action, every piece of equipment, every moment of your suspicious activities. The HOA board will have a complete and detailed record of your behavior when they review this case." I could almost hear the glee in her voice as she spoke. She wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She was relishing her power, finding joy in controlling every aspect of my life. Her words stung. I was trying to rebuild a boat. A simple task, made impossible by her incessant interference. But she didn't see it that way. To her, I was a criminal who needed to be stopped. It was as though my existence had become a threat to the neighborhood, and she wasn't going to rest until I was punished for daring to exist within the confines of her imagined rules. But as the days passed, I realized that something bigger was at play here. Rhonda's actions weren't just about the boat. They were about control. And the deeper I got into this feud, the more I saw how her need for control was destroying the peace of Pine Valley. The battle was escalating faster than I could have ever predicted. I had come to Pine Valley to find peace, to rebuild boats and enjoy the simple pleasures of lakeside living, but Rhonda was making sure that wasn't going to happen. She wasn't just annoyed by my boat repair, she was creating a narrative that made me out to be a criminal. She had turned a simple favor into a full-blown HOA war, complete with official investigations, fake security cameras, and her relentless control over every inch of the neighborhood. The next morning, as I stepped outside for my first cup of coffee, the full extent of her overnight work hit me. It wasn't just a few more signs this time. She had transformed my cabin into what looked like a military lockdown zone. Yellow tape, orange cones, and signs about unregistered watercraft were everywhere. The HOA flag was flying high, an oversized spectacle of power hanging in the air like some sort of personal declaration. But the most absurd of all was the loudspeaker system she had installed. Every 30 seconds, her pre-recorded voice blasted through the speakers, announcing that there was unauthorized marine activity threatening neighborhood safety. It was like being in a dystopian nightmare, except the villain wasn't some faceless government agent, it was a woman with too much time on her hands and too much control to give up. I stood there, staring at this makeshift fortress she'd created overnight. It was surreal, like something out of a bad comedy show. My property had become a spectacle, the eyes of the entire neighborhood on me. Some neighbors peered through their windows, others stood outside, clearly curious but unsure whether to get involved. I knew the tension was building. And for the first time in this absurd situation, I felt genuinely overwhelmed. That's when Edna appeared again, walking over to my cabin with an exasperated look on her face. She had lived here for decades and had seen it all, but I could tell that even she was shocked by the sheer level of Rhonda's obsession. "Logan, this isn't a violation," Edna said, her voice low but filled with disbelief. "It's performance art. Unhinged. Very expensive performance art." I chuckled darkly, trying to keep my emotions in check. The whole thing had become so ridiculous that it was hard to believe it was real. I couldn't imagine how much time and money Rhonda had poured into this production. Edna continued, "She just broke 5 HOA rules before breakfast. That's a record. Noise ordinance violations, unauthorized signage, you name it. The woman's lost it." I had to laugh. It was either that or scream. I looked over at the loudspeakers, the ridiculous warning signs, and the barricades that surrounded my property like a fortress. What had started as a simple task, helping a friend repair a boat, had turned into a full-scale drama. As the hours passed, it became clear that Rhonda wasn't going to back off. Every time I made progress on the boat, I could feel her eyes on me. I could practically hear her taking notes, documenting every little thing I did. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about Rhonda's need to control, her obsessive need to be right, no matter the cost. By noon, the noise from the loudspeakers was getting unbearable. It wasn't just the constant announcements, it was the fact that no one in the neighborhood could avoid hearing them. It was like living in a war zone. I could hear the whispers, the murmurs of neighbors gathering along the edge of their properties, some looking sympathetic, others simply watching with a sense of morbid curiosity. And then, as if on cue, Rhonda made her appearance again. This time, she wasn't just lurking with binoculars. She was standing at the edge of my property, clipboard in hand, acting like a sheriff overseeing a crime scene. "I've documented everything," she called out, her voice carrying across the driveway, full of self-importance. "Every action, every piece of equipment, every moment of your suspicious activities. The HOA board will have a complete and detailed record of your behavior when they review this case." Her words were laced with such a sense of triumph that it almost made me feel like I was in the wrong. But as I watched her, something clicked. This wasn't just about enforcing rules. This was her personal crusade. She wasn't trying to protect the neighborhood. She was trying to protect herself, to justify the time and energy she had spent turning this into a spectacle. I couldn't help but wonder, what had happened to Rhonda? What had made her so fixated on this power trip? It was clear she was no longer interested in maintaining a peaceful neighborhood. She was consumed by the idea that she was in control, that she had power over everyone in Pine Valley. That afternoon, after another round of nonsensical documentation and power plays, I realized that this was going to be bigger than I had ever anticipated. This wasn't just about fixing a boat. This was about standing up to someone who had turned the neighborhood into a playground for her ego. It was time to stop playing her game. And then came the sirens. The sound of sirens echoed through Pine Valley, slicing through the tense air like a knife. My stomach dropped. Every single nerve in my body was on high alert. This wasn't just some petty HOA violation anymore. This had escalated beyond anything I had imagined. Rhonda had called the police. Again. I had been elbow-deep in the boat engine, wrestling with a particularly stubborn fuel pump assembly, when I heard the sirens. I stopped what I was doing, wiping my hands on a rag, and stood still, listening to the sound getting louder. This wasn't just the usual noise that would fade away, this time, it was different. It was closer. The full force of the law was on its way, and I knew exactly why. Rhonda had convinced herself that she was protecting the community, but what she had failed to see was that her obsession was destroying everything she had once sworn to protect. What had started as a friendly favor, rebuilding a boat engine, had now spiraled into a full-blown conflict. My cabin, which had been my peaceful retreat, had become ground zero in a personal vendetta. I looked toward the road, just in time to see the flashing lights of a patrol car coming down the gravel path toward my cabin. I couldn't believe it was happening. Rhonda had somehow managed to turn a simple boat repair into a criminal investigation, and now the police were being dragged into it. The officer who stepped out of the car looked like he had dealt with this sort of thing before, an eye roll, a deep sigh, and the calm demeanor of someone used to dealing with angry neighbors and petty disputes. But this? This was different. There was a weight to the situation that made it feel much bigger than it was. "Morning, sir," Officer Martinez said as he approached, his tone flat, trying to gauge the situation. "I'm Officer Martinez. I'm here to respond to a report of possible theft of marine property. Can you tell me your relationship to this watercraft?" I tried to keep my voice steady, not wanting to come off as defensive. "Officer, I'm Logan Blake. I own this cabin. The boat belongs to a friend of mine, Wade Cobburn. I'm rebuilding the engine as a favor. Nothing more, nothing less." I could feel the officer's eyes scanning the situation, from the boat with its engine cover removed to the tools scattered around the driveway. And, of course, the orange warning signs, Rhonda's self-proclaimed barricade against my so-called criminal activity. Rhonda wasted no time jumping in, almost as if she had been rehearsing for this moment. He's operating without authorization. He's dismantling marine equipment that doesn't belong to him. There's no paperwork. No receipts. No proper documentation. Her voice grew louder, more shrill with each word, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for to catch me in the act. The officer didn't even flinch. He took the phone Rhonda handed him, scrolling through her photographic evidence of my every move over the past few days. I watched as he reviewed the images, his face neutral, but I could sense the skepticism in his posture. He didn't look convinced, not even remotely. "Ma'am, I appreciate your diligence in reporting suspicious activity," Officer Martinez said, his tone diplomatic but firm. "But I'm going to need to verify several things before taking any enforcement action." I exhaled a breath I didn't know I had been holding. For the first time in days, I felt a small glimmer of hope. The officer was doing his job, not blindly taking sides. But that didn't mean the situation was over. "Sir," he continued, turning to me, "can you provide me with any documentation that shows your authorization to work on this vessel?" I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. This was the moment. I had no paperwork. There was no formal agreement between me and Wade. Just a handshake, just trust between friends. And now that trust felt paper-thin. I swallowed hard and spoke, trying to remain calm. "Officer, I'm just helping out a friend. Wade asked me to rebuild the engine. We didn't think it was necessary to formalize anything. It's just one friend helping another. No paperwork involved. Nothing commercial." For a brief moment, there was a shift in Officer Martinez's demeanor. He paused, leaning closer to the boat, examining it more carefully now. As he approached the stern of the boat, I noticed something he had clearly spotted, a small metal plate mounted near the transom. It had registration details printed on it. "Sir," he said, his voice now tinged with a new level of curiosity, "you said this boat belongs to Wade Coburn?" "Yes," I said, nodding. "It does. Wade's a good friend of mine. We've known each other for years." Martinez read from the registration plate, his voice carrying over the awkward silence. "Wade Coburn. Pine County Sheriff's Department official equipment." The effect of those words was instant. I saw the crowd of neighbors, who had gathered at the edges of their properties to witness the ongoing drama, glance at each other with raised eyebrows. A wave of recognition swept through the group as they processed the implications of what Officer Martinez had just said. Rhonda's confident expression faltered for the first time. I could see her face slowly turn pale, the realization of what had just happened sinking in. She had spent days painting me as a thief, a criminal, when in fact, the boat I was working on belonged to someone far more official than she ever expected. The officer handed Rhonda her phone back with a polite nod. "Ma'am, thank you for your efforts," he said, his voice no longer the calm neutrality of an officer in control. "But I need to tell you that this boat is registered to Mr. Coburn, a Sheriff's Department asset. He's authorized to work on it, and so is Mr. Blake. This entire situation is based on a misunderstanding." The silence that followed was deafening. Rhonda was standing there, completely stunned, unable to comprehend the gravity of what had just been revealed. I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. Finally, the truth had come to light. Rhonda's entire crusade had been built on false assumptions. But even now, I knew this wasn't over. Rhonda wasn't the type of person who would back down easily. I could already see the gears turning in her mind as she tried to find a way to regain control of the situation. She had made herself the villain in this story, and no amount of facts could change the narrative she had already written in her mind. But I had something she didn't: proof. The weight of the truth was on my side now, and it felt like a small victory in a much larger battle that was far from over. The police may have walked away, but Rhonda's war was just beginning. The next day, I woke up with a strange sense of calm, though the chaos from the previous days still loomed over Pine Valley. The loudspeakers had been silent since Officer Martinez's visit, but Rhonda's war wasn't over. As the sun rose and I stepped outside, I could already see that the quiet I was craving wasn't going to last long. The neighborhood had settled into an uneasy stillness, but I could feel the tension hanging in the air, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. I made my way out to the boat again, determined to finish the repairs. I couldn't afford to let Rhonda's antics derail me any longer. I had a job to do, and despite everything, I was still a mechanic who needed to get this engine rebuilt. But as I stepped out of my cabin, my gaze fell on what awaited me. Yellow tape, orange cones, and more signs had appeared overnight. This time, the situation had escalated even further. Rhonda wasn't just trying to control my property, she had taken it to a whole new level of ridiculousness. The once peaceful cabin had now become the subject of full-blown theatrics. Every inch of my yard had been turned into an investigation zone, like something out of a movie. Edna had warned me that Rhonda wasn't going to stop. She had warned me that her obsession with control had already reached dangerous levels, and now, it was clear that I was her target. It was no longer just about the boat. It was about asserting her power, about forcing everyone around her to bend to her will, even if it meant making a spectacle of it. I walked around the perimeter of my property, mentally preparing for another day of interruptions. As I reached the back of my cabin, I saw Rhonda standing there, clipboard in hand, wearing the same self-satisfied expression she had worn the day before. This time, there was no pretending. She was a woman on a mission, one that she had convinced herself was for the greater good, when in reality, it was nothing more than a power trip. "Mr. Blake," she called out, her voice dripping with authority, "I trust you understand the seriousness of the situation now." I stopped, turning to face her. My hands were covered in grease, my mind preoccupied with the boat's engine, but Rhonda's voice had that tone, the tone of someone who thought she was untouchable, someone who believed she had the right to control everyone around her. "Rhonda, I've explained this 100 times," I said, trying to stay calm. "This boat belongs to a friend of mine. I'm fixing it. There's nothing illegal about it. I've done nothing wrong." She ignored my words, as she always did, and continued to talk down to me like I was the one causing the problem. "This neighborhood has standards that need to be upheld," she said, her voice now tinged with something more aggressive. "We can't just allow anyone to operate a watercraft without the proper approval. We can't allow unregistered vessels to be stored here. You're threatening the safety and the value of this entire community." I didn't bother responding immediately. I was getting used to her monologues, her desperate need to justify her actions, but I wasn't about to let her control the narrative anymore. The absurdity of the situation had reached its peak. The loudspeakers, the signs, the fake cameras, it was all part of her elaborate performance. The neighborhood wasn't at risk. The only thing at risk was Rhonda's fragile sense of control. I took a deep breath and decided it was time to end this charade. "Look, Rhonda," I said, my voice steady but firm, "I get that you think you're protecting something. But this has gone too far. You're harassing me, you're disrupting the entire neighborhood, and you're using HOA funds to wage a personal war against me over something that doesn't even matter. You're turning Pine Valley into a circus." Her face went red. "You have no idea what I've done for this community," she snapped. "You think this is all about you, but it's not. It's about protecting the integrity of our home, of our property values, of our way of life." The anger in her voice was rising, and I could see that the power she had once wielded with such authority was slipping through her fingers. She wasn't just defending property values, she was defending herself, defending a part of her identity that had been built on control. And the truth was, she didn't want to face the fact that she was in the wrong. But I wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. "Rhonda," I said, my voice softer but no less determined, this isn't about protecting anyone. This is about you needing to control every little thing around here. You're not trying to help the community. You're trying to force everyone to live by your rules, no matter how ridiculous they are. It's not healthy, and it's certainly not fair. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Rhonda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the unmistakable sound of a car approaching cut her off. It wasn't just any car, it was a patrol car. My heart sank. I wasn't sure whether Rhonda had called the cops again or if this was just a coincidence. Either way, I knew that the situation was escalating in ways I hadn't anticipated. When the patrol car came to a stop in front of my cabin, I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. This wasn't supposed to be happening. But Rhonda had somehow managed to turn a simple boat repair into a spectacle for the whole neighborhood, and the police. I walked toward the car, bracing myself for another confrontation. I wasn't sure how this would play out, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to back down. I had nothing to hide. And whatever Rhonda's plans were, they were about to come crashing down. The patrol car came to a halt in front of my cabin, and I knew the moment the officer stepped out that this would be the decisive moment in the battle that had turned my peaceful retreat into a battleground. The sound of gravel crunching beneath his boots made my stomach tighten. I had already dealt with the HOA's drama for days, but this time, it felt different. The police were involved, and that changed everything. Officer Ramirez stepped out of the car, his expression neutral, though there was a certain weariness to him that suggested this wasn't his first time dealing with neighborhood squabbles. As he approached, I could hear Rhonda's voice behind me, still talking about her community standards, and the supposed violations I was committing. I didn't want to waste time. This was it, the moment when I would either be dragged into her chaotic world or finally put an end to it. I squared my shoulders, took a deep breath, and turned to face Officer Ramirez. "Morning, officer," I said, trying to keep my tone respectful but firm. "I assume you're here because of the complaint that Rhonda's filed?" Officer Ramirez nodded, glancing toward Rhonda, who was still talking in circles about unregistered vessels and community property. "That's right. I've been called to investigate a possible violation of HOA rules." His eyes shifted to me, scanning the situation before he spoke again. "Can you explain what's going on here?" I took a moment to gather my thoughts, then spoke slowly and clearly. "I'm Logan Blake, and I own this cabin. This boat belongs to my friend, Wade Cobburn, and I'm just helping him rebuild the engine. There's nothing illegal going on here. We've known each other for years, and he asked me to do this for him as a favor." I gestured to the boat, still partially dismantled on my driveway, its engine exposed. "I'm not running a business. I'm not violating any rules. I'm just fixing an engine for a friend. That's it." Officer Ramirez listened intently, his face giving nothing away. I could tell he was trying to process everything, and I knew I had to give him all the facts. "Now, I understand that Rhonda here has some concerns about the HOA rules and the boat being stored on my property, but this is my land, and I've been upfront with everyone about what I'm doing. There's no need for all of this." I gestured to the ridiculous orange signs and fake security cameras surrounding my cabin. Rhonda, unable to stay silent any longer, stepped forward, her voice rising. "Mr. Blake is breaking multiple HOA rules. This boat shouldn't be here. It's a safety hazard, and it's violating our community's rules. The board needs to take immediate action." I could see the desperation in her eyes, the way she clutched her clipboard like it was her shield from everything she feared. But I wasn't about to let her dictate the terms of this situation anymore. "Officer, with all due respect, this isn't a matter of safety," I said, my voice rising slightly, but still calm. "This is about Rhonda's obsession with control. There are no safety issues here. I'm not causing any harm. I'm just fixing a boat, something I've done 100 times before. She's turned this into something it's not. The officer seemed to be considering my words, weighing both sides of the story. He glanced at Rhonda, then back at me, and I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He was no fool. "Ma'am," Officer Ramirez said, his tone measured but firm, "you've called in several complaints about Mr. Blake's boat. But you haven't provided any concrete evidence that he's violating any legal codes. He's working on his own property, with a boat that he clearly has a personal connection to. This doesn't seem like a criminal matter to me." Rhonda's face turned beet red, but she wasn't giving up yet. "But," she began, only to be cut off by the officer. "Ma'am," he said, holding up his hand to stop her, "you've made several accusations, but without clear evidence that any laws have been broken, there's nothing for me to act on." I could feel the tension in the air. Rhonda was sputtering, her words coming out in a jumble of frustration. But it was clear the officer wasn't swayed. The truth had been laid out, and it was on my side. Rhonda's grip on her clipboard tightened as she shot me a glare, her lips pressed together in a thin line. It was obvious that she wasn't ready to concede. She had built her whole identity around being in control, around being the enforcer of community rules. And now, she was being faced with the reality that those rules were only as powerful as the people who followed them, and they weren't hers to command anymore. Officer Ramirez gave one last glance at the boat, then turned back to Rhonda. "Ma'am, I suggest you rethink your approach here. I've already explained to Mr. Blake that he's within his rights to work on the boat. I don't see a need for further action." With that, the officer turned to leave, his duty done. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. Rhonda wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. As she watched Officer Ramirez drive away, I could see the flicker of realization in her eyes. This wasn't just about the boat. It was about control. And she was starting to lose it. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in Pine Valley shifted. Rhonda's reign of terror had finally come to an end, but not without leaving its mark. The signs came down, the fake cameras were dismantled, and the loudspeakers went silent. I was able to get back to work on the boat without the constant barrage of interruptions. I knew that Rhonda wouldn't go down quietly. She was too proud to admit she'd been wrong, too determined to hold on to her imagined power. But the community was waking up. The neighbors who had once been unsure of whose side to take were now seeing the truth. Rhonda had become a villain in her own story, and the neighborhood was ready to move on without her. A week later, I was finishing up the final touches on Wade's boat when the man himself showed up. Wade had heard about the chaos and came to see the boat in person. As we tested it on the lake, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The engine hummed smoothly, a testament to the work I'd done. As we headed back to the dock, Wade looked at me with a grin. "Logan, this thing runs better than it did when I first bought it. You really pulled through." I smiled back, feeling a surge of pride. "I told you I'd get it done." And as we watched the boat glide smoothly through the water, I realized that, despite everything, Pine Valley had become more than just a place to fix boats. It had become a lesson in resilience, in standing up to injustice, and in the power of community. With Rhonda's power finally broken, the neighborhood began to heal. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. People were starting to look out for each other again, focusing on what mattered: good neighbors, good friendships, and the quiet peace that had brought us all to Pine Valley in the first place. As I sat there on the dock, watching the sun set over the lake, I knew that no matter how many battles we faced, the most important thing was that we faced them together. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.